This is Kenya's biggest conversation, the Situation Room, broadcasting from Nairobi to around the country, Mombasa, Kisumu, Nakuru, Eldoret, Nyeri, Malindi. We are also broadcasting to the world on Spice FM KE, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We are on KTN Home, and we are live streaming the show. Spice FM KE, YouTube, Facebook. I said that. And www.spicefm.co.ke. So, we are waiting to hear from the Judicial Service Commission because there are candidates that have applied following the advertisement by the Judicial Service Commission for a position of Chief Justice of the Republic of Kenya and a position to fill the vacancy in the Supreme Court. A number of candidates applied. Some applied for both positions. Some applied for one. You know where my crystal ball tells me who's going to be our next Chief Justice, but that's not what we're going to discuss today. Let's talk about the number of candidates who've applied for the position of Chief Justice and position of a Judge of the Supreme Court of Kenya, and the number of female candidates that we've seen this time. Somebody who's really been keen on the issue of gender and gender inclusivity, especially the issue of women in positions of leadership, leads a campaign called We Are 52%. She's a lawyer, she's a feminist, she's a policy analyst, she's a writer. She joins us on the line. She's Marilyn Kamuru. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the Situation Room.
Thank you for having me.
Marilyn, let's just start off by asking, what is We Are 52%?
So you said I lead it. Actually, I don't. We Are 52% is a feminist collective, and we've been advocating around equality, inclusion, and representation of women and marginalized groups. And we've been doing this. We did this around the dissolution of parliament campaign to ensure parliament was compliant with the two-thirds gender rule and multiple court orders. We've done this around appointments, rather unsuccessfully. But really, it's a campaign that's about making sure that women, young women especially, remain politically active and are not pushed to the margins, and that we continue to insist that leadership in this country and representation needs to reflect the country, needs to reflect the demographics of this country, which includes, a population that's almost 50% women, actually more than 50% really, and young people. And we continue to see a leadership that is very far removed from that.
Marilyn, when you use the word feminist, what do you mean by it?
Well, what I mean by feminist, I'm an African feminist, and I think there are lots of African feminisms, and this can be an intellectual conversation sometimes. But what I mean by feminist is that women are people, that women are not appendages of men. We are not other. There's a centrality, especially as a lawyer, there's a centrality to men in law that makes it very difficult for the law to see women as equal partners. Indeed, in 2010, for the first time in our history, the Constitution recognized women as equal citizens. That's a very recent development. And so for me, feminism, and my feminism in particular, is about the practice of reaching a socially just society, one which does not privilege men, as has historically been the case.
I am actually thinking about what you've said, doesn't privilege. So you're coming from the position that women have historically been underprivileged, and their actual position and role and being within the society of human beings has never been acknowledged and treated with the equality it deserves. Have I got it right?
Not really, actually, because I'm coming from the position that patriarchy as a system has privileged men. And there's a way in which a lot of feminists will choose to approach it the way you have. So you're not wrong. But I choose to approach it from looking at male privilege. And the reason that that's important, especially in the discussion we're having today, is, for instance, the provisions of our Constitution, which deal with not more than two-thirds. And so that provision is actually focused not on a minimum inclusionary principle, but on a limitation on the dominance of a majority, right? So essentially what our provision on gender provides is that no gender should have a supermajority in bodies. And so it's concerned about dominance. And I think that goes back to the sharing of power principle, devolution. We as a nation were very concerned about concentration of power and dominance by certain groups. And so that cuts across the entire Constitution. And that's one of the things that I think is often lost when we talk about, women's representation. We're not talking about tokenism. We're talking about making sure that our systems and our bodies more and more reflect our society.
Marilyn, the debates are loud and they've gotten louder and louder over time, especially because then audience has been given to this debate and this conversation. And we start to see a little bit of movement here and there, whether it's on corporate boards and then a little bit in terms of government and elections and things like that. Many would also argue that there's still a very long way to go in terms of this. And I think that there is. Do we see a shift in this conversation because people are starting to have an innate understanding of why it's important to include women? Or are people reacting to the noise and saying, we don't want to hear this anymore, let us just act so that we can dull the noise down a little bit?
Yeah, that's actually very prescient, though. But I think it's both. I think you've hit it on the head. It's both. We are making progress. No doubt we're making progress. The Constitution is evidence of the progress, right? We're definitely making progress, but there's also a backlash. There's also a reaction. And a lot of that reaction is driven by people who are vested in the status quo. I like to remind people that one of the things that the gender principle does is that it integrates the political elite in a way that they were not comfortable with, because it forces them to seek allies in areas that they never sought allies, right? Suddenly you find that, and it's not just the gender principle, even regional representation. So when we talk about, for instance, the Supreme Court has tended to be an institution that is dominated by men, including illegally since 2010. Actually, since 2010, we've never had a constitutionally compliant Supreme Court. That's appalling, And so while we're making progress in the legal provisions, we continue to have public bodies, in this case the JSC, that are resistant to actually respecting and upholding the law. And it's having a ripple effect in society. I think what we see is that I think the speaker provided a public advisory after CJ Maraga issued his advisory to the president on the dissolution of parliament in September of 2020. And the speaker in response basically said, why is everybody focusing on parliament? The Supreme Court is unconstitutional. The national cabinet is unconstitutional. Why are you all focusing on parliament? So part of what these unconstitutional bodies have done is create the culture of impunity and make it more difficult for any of these bodies to hold each other accountable. And that's why it is incredibly important that as the JSC engages in this recruitment, they ensure we have a compliance court. They make sure that we cannot have more than 4 members of either gender. We cannot have 5 men on this court. We certainly can't have them fill both of these vacancies with men. Indeed, legally, only one of these vacancies can be filled by a man.
So if we look at it that way now, we're coming to the composition of the Supreme Court and also the next appointment of the Chief Justice. So what you've said is we have a vacancy in the Supreme Court. Right now, out of the 7 judges that have been there, only 2 have been women. And if we were to look at the balance and the constitutional requirement, how many should be women at a minimum?
Okay, so I'm gonna push you guys on this, and I want to push you on this because legally this is the law. It is not how many minimum; it is how many maximum. What's the cap? The cap of any gender is 4 because there are 7.
Okay.
So there can be no more than 4 of the majority gender. There are currently 3 men on the court, which means there's only 1 available position for a man on the court. If there was more than that, then they're in violation of the provisions of the Constitution and a recent case, Petition 566 of 2015.
Okay. Now we have some women who have applied for position of Chief Justice, and some have applied for both the vacant position as well in the Supreme Court. So it would also not be good to have both positions filled by women.
No, that would be fine.
Or we'd have 4?
We'd have 4.
Okay.
Yes, and it's important to start to challenge this. It's become almost a de facto rule that men must be the majority in bodies, and that's something that we should challenge. And if the women are qualified, and in this case we have some of the most qualified women, absolutely they could be 4.
So here's my other question. I understand both of them can be filled by women, but can they really? When we have the Deputy Chief Justice being a woman, can we also have a Chief Justice who's a woman?
Absolutely. There is no legal bar. And I will remind you, the President and Deputy President are not of alternate genders. And while this has been something that has been proposed a lot, especially by the political elite, when women are insisting on greater representation, it has the potential to essentially create women as a category, right? So we are always deputizing men. In this case, for instance, one of the applicants for CJ is a world-renowned international expert in areas from land to environment to gender. She sat on the Committee of Eminent Persons and really has a really renowned reputation, former Dean of Nairobi Law School, a builder of institutions. So when you have that kind of caliber of candidates, to then go back to these traditions that are nowhere in law is really a testament to our fear of excellence, I think. Why are we so afraid of merit?
If I hear you correctly, what you seem to be pushing for when you call it equal representation is affirmative action.
Yes. And that's affirmative action is also the language that's used in the Constitution, yes.
Yes. So affirmative action simply means that by virtue of desiring this balance, then it must be done. Women must be in positions of representation up to a certain quota. Is that it?
Exactly. That it is not up to the public bodies to decide by themselves. That in addition to the qualifications, one of the qualifications is actually gender representation. Exactly. You got it, CT.
On that, Marilyn, the thing is, and I think that maybe a little bit of a deeper understanding needs to happen here, because a lot of people then would ask the question that, okay, so essentially what we're doing is that we are forcing the selection of women, quote unquote forcing. And can that be explained by saying that being left to selection, the selection would not be a woman, for example, because of, certain traditional practices, whatever has been the case over time, that the first selection would not be a woman. The first selection would not be a woman. And so what you're saying by affirmative action is that you're saying put a woman in that position and then see what would happen, because you're not likely to make that selection on your own.
No, I think we need to be careful about two things. First of all, that debate is done, right? So affirmative action is in the Constitution.
Yes, but you've also said things that are in the Constitution are not practiced to date, right?
But I think that what I'm suggesting is we make them optional when we have these discussions like this, right? So we don't have discussions about, is it okay then if I just shoot my neighbor because he's constantly having parties at 3 a.m. in the morning? We don't discuss that. Why it's illegal? We don't create a forum that allows people to have an alternative view when something has been deemed illegal. And I think the challenge, especially with affirmative action and gender representation, is that we have created a forum for people to debate the law, to basically create the context in which they justify their violation of the law, right? That's exactly what the speaker was saying when he was saying, why do I have to comply? Why does Parliament have to comply? Supreme Court is unconstitutional, Cabinet is unconstitutional. While Parliament is the body itself that approved the President's nominees for Cabinet. So what this unconstitutionality does is perpetrates unconstitutionality. An unconstitutional body is going to endorse another unconstitutional body, is going to step back from accountability with another unconstitutional body. So I think what is incredibly important for those of us who have platforms, for those of you in media, is to hold people accountable to, listen, we're not negotiating the law unless you're proposing an amendment to the law. But until that time, we need to follow the law. JSC legally cannot do anything other than recruit in compliance with the Constitution.
You know, you put across your case beautifully. Now, let me introduce a certain concept that often creeps into this discussion. It's called reality. Okay?
I live in the real world.
Oh, I have no doubt that you do. You see, in situations where, for instance, you're talking about appointments and you're talking about balancing the odds, I see it clearly. But when you bring it to the political sphere where you are now introducing the concept of an election, okay?
Right.
What then do? Do you ensure that political parties have to guarantee that their representation when it comes to people who are presented for elections have that balance? Do you change the law so that instead of having a presidential system, we have a parliamentary system, and we ensure that political parties by law must have that representation? What do we do?
Well, I think we've tried a variety of things, and we're going to keep doing a variety of things. I'm very cognizant, CT, and I think it is a very valid point, that law doesn't create the society in which we live. In many ways, law is aspirational, right? It's saying this is the society we want to live in. But I think for me, one of the things that we really must be concerned with as Kenyans is, where are we going? What's the direction, right? And when the direction is contrary to where we have said we want to go as a country, then part of what we have to do is say, what are the tools available to us to pull people back, right? Some of those are law. Others are creating the social context, the environment. This is what we're doing with this conversation, where we are basically saying, you know what? First of all, we see the illegality that's happening, and it's not okay. We're not condoning it. We're not going to be silent about it. And it can be powerless at times. It can be extremely frustrating. I was a lead petitioner in the case that challenged the constitutionality of cabinet. We won that case, and the president went ahead to nominate another unconstitutional parliament with the assistance of parliament. It is incredibly frustrating, but we must continue. We will make progress because we don't acquiesce. And so not having all of the solutions does not prevent us from trying.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But then there's something else that also creeps into a certain aspect of reality that creeps into this discussion. You see, with gender parity, as we're now talking about it, brings in the reality of the respect that comes with it. You see, when you talk about a level playing field, if I may use that term, there are other issues that also come into the discussion. That is, for instance, how then do you consider that there is parity when one part of your society expects things to be given? I'm talking perception here, and the other one thinks that they should earn it. Let me explain what I mean. Gender parity, unfortunately, cannot be a discussion that is unburdened by the norms that we have lived by for the longest time and the contributions that we made to these norms by both genders. For instance, when we talk about the perception of the role of women and the role of men, the contribution to what you've called the patriarchal, the generosity of the dominance, the role of women has often been mentioned as being a very huge contributory factor to this, as in the mothers and the way they treat their sons, and the mothers and the way in which they treat their daughters. Yes, exactly. These are the realities of the discussion. And if we are talking about this and we're seeking to understand it, I would ask you and people who are championing this, how far do you take this discussion? Now, this is my favorite point. In our educational system, so that these are discussions and realities that young people encounter right from their primary to secondary school. So it isn't a discussion that hits you in the face when you're an adult, but it's something that you encounter at an early age and you begin to interact with. How far do you take these discussions, and how far do you ensure that these things are entrenched in the communities and society that we live in?
I know we live in a radically different world that I grew up in, right? So I know these discussions are already happening, and some of them are not discussions. Some of them are just the way we experience the world, right? When I was growing up and I wanted to be a lawyer, there weren't that many female lawyers. So I saw Martha Karua, I saw Martha Kome, one of the women who is a candidate for, both for Chief Justice and the Supreme Court judgeship. I saw these women and I was, fascinated by them, But now a young girl sees so many lawyers that it's probably not even impressive for her anymore. So the world is changing. And there are the discussions, the formal discussions we have. We continue to have them. My sons and I are constantly debating at the table, talking about, representation. It's difficult not to when your mom does this work. But we talk about what does that mean for them as well. And we talk about what patriarchal privilege means and why that is important. And why I want to keep returning to that is because that's what creates what men say they have earned is actually what they feel entitled to, which is why there is no question when there is a man as president and a man as deputy president. But suddenly there's an uproar if there's the possibility of a woman chief justice and a female deputy chief justice, even though some of the most exemplary candidates for the position of chief justice are women, right? So when I say that privilege, I'm not saying it in a way that says, you're sitting there and hoarding things. I'm talking about centuries of expectations that do take a while. And we have to gently sometimes tell people, hey, just so you know, what you are thinking is abnormal is actually not.
Let's look at the Chief Justice selection now, and even now members to the Supreme Court. Do you think that these selections are under threat still of this norm that we've seen for centuries? Do you think that it's under threat today as we see it?
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing that. We're seeing narratives around, we're seeing, last minute desperate attempts to besmirch character of, one of the candidates who's a Court of Appeal judge. None of these people have made complaints before, which they could have since she was a Court of Appeal judge. Another candidate who has an exemplary record. And so we start to see these last-minute attempts, these last-ditch attempts, and they're about making the path easier for some of the less qualified candidates.
And do you think these things are coming about as a result of their being female? Do you think these last-minute attempts come as a result of that?
Gender, and I think some of it is, there is a deeply entrenched misogyny, but I think also some of it is really just political interest. And I think that's what should concern us more as Kenyans, is that when people want weaker candidates, by definition, what they are looking for is weaker systems. They're looking for systems that are less inclined to serve public interest, more inclined to serve political interest. So as Kenyans, even if you don't care about gender representation, and I would urge you to care, because it's not going to be possible for us to develop as a society without having more of each gender involved, even if you don't care about that, you should care that we select the best quality candidates.
Marilyn, what efforts do you and people who... Please, finish what you're saying, then I will ask you my question, please.
I think one of the things that we're doing, which is very, very dangerous, is we're creating an environment where public service is being left by people with excellence, people who have integrity, who have unblemished records, because of the way recruitment processes are being managed. So what we're doing is actually people are choosing not to engage in these processes. And by doing that, we're leaving this space to people, some of whom do not have integrity questions, but are certainly weaker candidates and not the caliber of Kenyans that we're producing in other areas. CT, I'm sorry.
Oh, no. It's I should apologize. The point you're making is a valid one, but think about it for a second, Marilyn. Huh? We have decision-making bodies like the Judicial Service Commission, very, very important roles. We have Parliament. But so long as the dominant voice, forget the male aspect of it, because it's not just male. The dominant Kenyan perspective and voice is expediency. So what do we sacrifice at this altar of excellence that we are seeking? People who are chosen specifically, and it isn't just in the judicial service. It is in every sphere of public life. You will find that people who end up in positions of authority are probably the worst possible candidates in terms of the bar that had been set by that body. And you wonder, how did this person creep into this position?
But they were the best for other interests.
They were best, thank you very much. They were best for other interests. So the effort, even as we talk about this, should be made in getting people to understand the damage that is actually caused when we actually sell ourselves short when it comes to these things, because the damage is profound.
CT, you should be on my side. We're saying the same thing. I mean, that is really it.
And why did you think I wasn't on your side, Marilyn?
No, I just mean you should be sitting here next to me. You know?
Oh.
Yes.
All right. Okay.
Next time I'm going out to speak to people, we should be going. I think that why it's important that we're having this conversation as the recruitment is going on is so that we can inject our voices as Kenyans into this process. JSC must understand that the scrutiny we're giving is because we are concerned about the caliber of candidates that get selected. So in the CJ position, they've shortlisted 10. They had 13 applications. To be honest, I think that an equal opportunity approach would have been to shortlist 4, have 2 men and 2 women, right? And that should be the practice going forward, because then what you do is you actually say, we're going to even this playing field. It makes shortlisting harder, but it also creates the context where the shot is fair.
Yep.
It's a level playing field. But we have 10 now. 7 of them are men. 3 of them are women. We have 5 judges. We have, I think, 2 professors? I think we have 2 professors and 3 legal practitioners, right?
Yep.
So we've got a nice diverse list. But one of the things that for me I find really concerning is that JSC has chosen to shortlist people who have, careers and in legal practice as solo practitioners. They're going to head the 3rd branch of government. You need people who have extensive administrative and managerial experience, and I'm not confident that that's the kind of experience you would have as a solo practice. They haven't told us what they're going to do about practices. I mean, if you're the solo practitioner, that means all those cases, you are institutional memory. How are we going to deal with that? Because, again, there comes a conflict of...
Marilyn, let me just pause you there. I think you're trying to preempt the interview process. And that's...
I'm sorry, this entire discussion is preempting the interview process.
Yes.
Because what I'm trying to do is inform the process, right?
Okay.
It's to say these are the things we need to think about.
Indeed.
It's not to say that they're not, it's to say that they need to be on the table. And so far, they've not been on the table.
Fair enough.
So I think
Fair
those
enough.
are things that are important.
Fair enough. Marilyn Kamuru, feminist, lawyer, writer, policy analyst, thank you very much for joining us. When the interviews commence, let's have this conversation, right? Let's look at the candidates, what each candidate is saying, and then what we should be looking for, what we should expect of our next Chief Justice and our new member of the Supreme Court of Kenya. Asante sana.
Asanteni.
Thank you very much.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.